Glad to see you all here for this subject of budget restrictions and how CISO in France and everywhere else can keep on working and innovating and develop and counter threats with budgets that are fairly restricted. They used to be increasing, they had been increasing for 15 years, but now they are stabilizing. So we are feeling that some budget are reduced or at least restricted. There's a stagnation with big clients. For some smaller clients, they are increasing with different attacks. So this roundtable is has its objective is to exchange what we can do to achieve more with less. That's the question that is asked. We will have some expert insights. I have the pleasure to welcome on this roundtable Esther Chijik-Boyer. So here, she's Group CISO with CNP Assurance, and she's administrator of CESIN, a French CISO organization. She will give some insights on this optimization of budget with her financial training that can help. We have ANSI, the French Cybersecurity of France, with Aurélie Coton, who is Chief of Staff at the Division of Strategy. She will share the view of the agency on the cyber industry with an environment undergoing more and more threats, cyber attacks. We also have Patricia Egger, Security Risk and Governance Manager at Proton, Proton that you all know. They sell technology for encryption. There are a lot of certification, standardization challenges. So we are very glad to have her view on this subject. Then we have two solution providers with Romain Lenné, with working with Mail and Black, and he's product marketing manager, and he will see how we can act with this budget reduction. And then we have Luc Cotin, who is CISO and CEO of R-Secure, which is a small startup located in Luxembourg, who was awarded for their cybersecurity strategy in Luxembourg. And I am one of the co-founder and partners of ForMind for cybersecurity solution provider ForMind and consulting. So one of the first idea is to know where we can focus our efforts, and also can we put less pressure where no pressure is needed when there's no threat, no significant threat. So maybe Esther, maybe I'll give you the floor first. Our environment is quite complex, and risk appears continuously. There's no real reduction of budget, but there's a stagnation. It's a complex equation that we have to solve. We have to prioritize things, and this means prioritizing means deprioritizing other things, and that's important to have that in mind. And what does it mean? It means we accept a risk. And we can do whatever we want, whatever we can. There will always be a risk to accept because the cyber risk is too significant. So how can we react to the attack that we can undergo?
Donc, on parle souvent beaucoup d'approche par les risques, réduire le risque.
We often hear about a risk approach. How can we go from risk? But I'd say we have to have a financial approach. We need to put more funding where we need to attenuate the risks, the bigger risks.
Quelque part aussi en train
So we were
couvrir, enfin ce que j'appelle se mettre hors.
We were covering the main threats, the main breaches, that what we were working to do for the past years, and that was fine. That was what we had to do. But now we are in a new era where this is all done. But let's stop and think about what we where we want to invest and where we can have ROI, return on investment, and where we can, with lesser costs, reduce and cover more risks.
Oui, mais peut-être Aurélie.
So maybe Aurélie, a reaction to that? So I'm given the mic on the regulation part. So achieve more with an increasing threat. Vincent Schrobo talked about it during the plenary, so I won't go back to this. But as a national agency, we have this rule, this law approach.
And this is what we're trying to do with NIS2 and with regulatory simplification. We want to produce, to make NIS2 and the standards the core of our standards and of our security requirements in France, and also for European harmonization, so that this standard is a sort of backbone of cybersecurity with a proportionate approach based on proportionality to adapt security requirements for SMEs and for future large entities, and then for essential entities to have a progressive approach to cybersecurity. So we have this regulatory lever which will be there to help you as CISOs to manage the risks and to help the smaller entities to cope with their first risk, which is the cybercrime risk. The other point we need to see with the regulations, which you may have heard about, is the Cyber Resilience Act, which is more for the solution and product providers and which will bring in minimum requirements for security products and services. A simple example is in the future with the entry into force of the CRA, a password with by default 000 will not be allowed. And we have seen a certain number of attacks on firewalls and VPNs which have used vulnerabilities, exploited vulnerabilities linked to these default passwords. And in the future, these regulations on products and services will also help you to have more trust in how you can manage the most basic risks. So the regulations give the impression that you're always being asked to do more, but the ambition is to simplify and optimize the approach. Patricia, on
focusing on the highest risk zones and on the requirements of certifications. As an international player in certification, you're well positioned to talk about this. How would you manage this? We have the same issue for ROI. For us, it didn't work for Proton. Choosing a financial value. We tried this once, but we gave up quite quickly because there were other factors of reputation and others which took the upper hand, and which we perhaps, it wasn't possible for us to define a figure, an amount which could produce the results that we wanted. And I agree entirely that we have also a risk-based approach like everybody. But I think everybody agrees on the concept generally until it comes to accepting the risk. And there, I think it's quite impressive to see people who've been working in security for years, and when we say that we want to accept a risk, immediately they're saying, yes, but all the same, we have to do something. And I think the discussion here is if we're accepting a risk, that means we do have to accept a risk and move on. Otherwise, we try to do everything at the same time, and it's catastrophic. What we have set up, and which I find works very well, is a federation of risk management in that we make the heads of the different departments accountable. How can I say that in French? We make them the owners of the risks, and I think that this is a very good way of doing things, because instead of the security, having a centralized security function saying no to everything, we establish a framework of how we manage the risks, how we manage them, and what the processes are, and then the heads of the departments will be the people who will accept the risk or not. So they don't come to us to ask for things, and then they'll say, the security said we couldn't do this, and we say, so we've done a risk assessment, this is the result, and now do what you think is right. If you think it's worth doing this, do it knowing what the risks are. If with what we've said you think it's not a good idea, then don't do it. And I think this way of doing things has done a lot to change the mentalities of people at Proton, at least, and it's a very efficient way of having genuine security in the face of risk. Romuald, perhaps, on the identification of risks. And what's interesting is to prove what the risk is by showing companies where the risks are and providing them with tools so they're better informed. We have a password manager. We propose to our staff to use put all their passwords in the manager. It checks whether the passwords are compromised, and we see that about 50% of them are and can be found in the dark web or give access to sensitive data. So when we can show the executive committee that there is a genuine challenge and vulnerabilities in the companies, they can make informed decisions and then allocate the budgets to secure that access and to provide the budgets to the CISOs and to show the impact of this poor management of passwords in the company. This can apply to passwords, to email management, to seeing how the staff respond to such and such an email. Do they click on the malicious links? And this is a way then of being informed and allocating the company's budgets. Luc, your point of view, perhaps, with the view of the SMEs, which perhaps have difficulty even understanding the risks, to prioritize them. Absolutely. Hello, everybody. In Luxembourg, we have the same issue. I think it's pretty much the same everywhere. What we try to do is have a pragmatic approach, a risk-based approach. We try to draw up an inventory to review the situation, assess the client's IT assets, then identify the risks, Often companies aren't even sure of what they have. So we begin by an assessment, and we try to play an important role, as has just been explained, with the executive or management committees, and the CISO must have that contact with the management committee to be able to get the budgets and to present the risk analysis with all the NIS2 and ISO standards, which require an overall risk assessment. So you can't do everything, so we try to prioritize this, and then it's up to the CISO to show and to understand the priorities in the risk analysis. There are lots of free tools which exist. We try, obviously, not to make sure that even the risk assessment represents a big budget, so the CISO has to be trained to do that. The second focus mentioned in the preparation, and this will perhaps be more of concern to big groups, is that in big groups generally we have entities which perhaps work separately with different regulations. So we have silos, different types of standards and certifications, and in each business line they're developing similar things in parallel. So perhaps we have to see how we can rationalize or industrialize or pool this, so that this should, at least on paper, make it possible to reduce costs or restrict costs. Perhaps Aurélie, does NIS2, which is an additional regulation which is going to impose, is it going to impose additional requirements, or can we see NIS2 as a driver for a lever for industrializing and gaining in efficiency?
Oui, c'est ce que je disais tout à l'heure.
Yes, as I was saying earlier,
encore une fois, la réglementation est toujours perçue.
The regulations are always perceived as being something that is an additional requirement, but with NIS2, the approach is to have a horizontal regulation, meaning that we have a common core of security requirements which can apply to all sectors and which may be equivalent to existing regulations. So it's a common basis on which we then add the sector-specific aspects, and this will enable us to rationalize, meaning that you, as CISOs, we want it to be clearer for you, so that you're not facing a whole range of requirements and that things are more legible and perhaps easier to apply, and we'll see later what is going to be done to provide support to help you in this implementation. Aurélie or Patricia, Estelle or Patricia, have you worked on the subjects of sharing, pooling or industrialization? Very briefly, at Proton, it's very decentralized. A lot of things are decentralized. So when we try to implement things, it can be quite difficult because the processes are so different that we don't necessarily manage to come up with something that works for everybody. So what we've tried to do generally is to have a hybrid model where we have part which is managed centrally, the policies, processes, etc., and some centralized tools. But we also allow the different departments also to do things in their own way that fit in with their processes, and we try to push them in the right direction, but we do allow them to do things to some extent in their own way, to try to have the best of all worlds, to meet the criteria we have imposed, but then to be able to do things differently as long as it is done with all the security controls.
Alors peut-être que je peux rebondir effectivement. Donc, la mutualisation, je pense que c'est un mot assez clé. Déjà, c'est le principe même de l'assurance, la mutualisation.
of assurance. And for us as an insurance
qu'effectivement,
company,
il y a plusieurs axes sur la mutualisation, plusieurs périmètres, si je puis dire. Le premier, c'est déjà, ne serait-ce qu'au sein de mon groupe, effectivement, c'est ce que tu disais un peu, Patricia, c'est-à-dire que le groupe CNP, c'est plusieurs entités de taille très variée, avec des SI décentralisés. Partant de là, voilà, des réalités très différentes selon les entités, selon les pays. Mais ça n'empêche qu'au niveau du groupe, on peut quand même centraliser quelque part ou harmoniser peut-être certaines pratiques. Donc nous, le parti qu'on a pris, c'est quelque part un catalogue de services pour nos filiales. Un catalogue de services où certains sont obligatoires et d'autres sont facultatifs. Donc dans les obligatoires, évidemment, on va avoir par exemple notre référentiel d'évaluation des risques. Ça, c'est obligatoire pour tous parce qu'on doit avoir la même vision partout. On a aussi des outils, je pense notamment à notre outil de suivi des vulnérabilités qui est centralisé parce qu'on a besoin d'avoir cette vision globale. Et d'autres qui sont facultatifs à la carte. Et en fait, en faisant ça, quelque part, c'est de l'efficience pour tout le monde. Alors, pas que financière, d'ailleurs, mais parce que c'est des contrats qu'on va faire une fois pour tout le groupe. Donc ça veut dire aussi que les achats, le juridique, c'est pas juste chez les SSI, mais achats juridiques aussi, quelque part, également du temps. Et aussi, forcément, quand on est plus gros, en général, on a des meilleurs tarifs. Ça, c'est aussi un axe. Donc, c'est vraiment déjà, voilà, au sein du groupe, d'essayer de mutualiser ce qu'on peut.
To share, to pool what we can, because the reality is that my group is quite fragmented.
Je pense qu'il y a un deuxième axe également, c'est la mutualisation, je dirais, au sein de notre écosystème. Donc, on vit dans un écosystème très large, et je pense notamment à nos tiers, parce que assommer nos tiers à coups de questionnaires, chacun va poser ses propres questions dans un ordre différent, c'est pas forcément efficace pour l'écosystème en général. Là, je parle de mes tiers, mais bon, je suis moi-même un tiers, hein, donc
I'm also a third party
et donc là, si je parle de CNP en particulier, on a choisi une solution du marché pour évaluer nos tiers, ce qui permet effectivement aux tiers de le partager à d'autres clients. Mais voilà, je pense qu'il y a encore beaucoup de travail au sein de la communauté pour voilà, converger quelque part vers... alors, je ne sais pas si ça pourrait être un questionnaire posé par notre régulateur, par exemple, ou par quelqu'un d'autre d'ailleurs, ou alors plus travailler aussi sur les équivalences entre les différentes certifications. Tu parlais de la certification, voilà, il y a les différentes certifications qui existent, voilà, c'est trouver les équivalences pour ne pas s'assommer les uns les autres à coups de questionnaires.
Est-ce que
does Romuald or Luc want to add something? Do you see any axes, areas of all-in-one solutions to bring everything together and avoid having too many different solutions that are all complementary for excessive costs? Yes, indeed. We see that there's a multiplication of the tools that are used in enterprises, so we need to put in common all the tools, analyze what are the behaviors with emails or passwords management. I want to use all this data to have the right alerts at the right time. If I have a proper awareness for cybersecurity, it has a good impact in comparison to a newly arrived collaborator that clicks everywhere. So with all those alerts that we receive daily, we can analyze them, prioritize them, and address them at the right time. So, because maybe some issues are not as important as others. So we need to address them at the right time. I think that everything was said. In our case, we work with a lot of SMEs, so it's very complicated to force them to use this or that tool. What we offer is a mapping between the standard that is ISO 27001 and other regulations. And some of our clients are completely lost. So we use international reference frameworks and to make the framework of our clients without reinventing everything. So it's not like in bigger groups where they put everything common within the group. We generalize everything for this smaller client. So we want to avoid the creation of silos within the company. When we see the number of booths that we see in the exhibit hall, we can see that there are silos, and seeing that, can you see a trend of an all-in-one solution? Can you see there's an emergence of those whole package offers? And that could reduce costs? Or do you see that we are all doing our own business in the cybersecurity ecosystem? I have a point of view, but it's not firm. At CNP and my group, we have a multiplication of different tools, like a lot of you, I think. It's a historical development. We saw a breach, we covered it. So there's a piling of tools. It's complicated to manage daily. It goes in every way, but if I'm talking about the reality of today, there's a piling, and also we are not exploiting every tool to the fullest. On an ROI, in terms of ROI, we're not very efficient in our management. So maybe before changing, maybe we need to know our tools better to exploit them to the fullest. So when we covered the main breaches, is it efficient? Is it how we want to work with this very diversified array of tools? So we are satisfied with this tool. We have always worked with this tool. That's what people say. Maybe people tend to see the workload that that comes with changing a tool. So we are making platforms. We search for a single provider to have a single platform, but do we want to be dependent on this one single provider and dependent on their prices and their price demands? And if we have a problem, we can't change providers anymore. I think there's a middle point between one single provider and several providers. But at my group, we are addressing this issue, and this means make minds evolve.
Just if I could add something. Personally, I don't I think the question which is asked here, which is raised here, and to which the private providers will have to answer is how do we address the SMEs? How do we come up with packaged solutions for small companies, small entities, small local authorities to address the first levels of cybersecurity and with securing their systems? There are a lot of people offering things, lots of solutions. There are lots of groups. Big groups have lots of tools, but we have to see how to rationalize all this. But for small companies, the IT manager in a small company, how do we get them on board and provide the level of security for this essential economic fabric of small companies? If I could give the point of view of Proton, and this perhaps different from most cases, we buy almost nothing. I'm exaggerating slightly, but in terms of security, we have built everything ourselves. With open source tools, we don't have this stack of different solutions, but we have other problems, but we don't have this problem of having lots of different solutions. But because we build everything ourselves and try to take bits from solutions that exist to do something different, we often come up against the problem of incompatibility between certain systems which don't use the same standards. And for us, this is one of the most important things, is to see whether we can take two things and get them to work together. And in that respect, it has to be open source, otherwise we can't touch it. There need to be standards that exist. So for we use relatively few commercial tools, but our biggest problem at the moment is the ISO tax, because to be able to use our identity manager, etc., we always have to have a license of the level above, and very often it's only this that interests us. So we have constructed a lot of things around this to be able to fill the gaps. Which is perhaps a message for publishers. It would be good not to have a tax. That would be very useful for us. It's true that on our side, with the multiplication of solutions, we try to propose multiple solutions on the same platform to be able to get the IT managers to work on a single platform without having to juggle with different tools. Our objective is to multiply the solutions in a unified way on the same platform or around the same platforms, and to get the end user. It's important for staff in a company, rather than having to juggle with different tools, which is tiring. And people often talk about SaaS fatigue, having one pass for different passwords for different tools. So to try to multiply the solutions on a given platform to facilitate engagement and the adoption of these solutions on a day-to-day basis. So we tend to try to unify everything for the end users, the staff in companies. It's a bit of a paradox, because in SMEs we try to have as few tools as possible. The more tools we have, the bigger the risk exposure surface. And we see that there's a problem of companies go out and get a tool, but first of all you have to rationalize things. And our role as a startup is to try to go and see our customers and to draw up an inventory of all the tools they have to try to reduce this. Often they have things duplicating the same thing. Sometimes they have tools they don't even remember. And so we try to rationalize the tools. I agree with the idea of having just one platform, but then the question is, if we put everything in one tool, what happens if that tool breaks down? And so we have to have plans, maintenance plans, and plans in case of a disaster. So it's always like running around in circles. No matter what we do, we have to think of what happens if we do have an issue, and I have experienced cases where customers no longer had access to their emails. So it can be very interesting.
On n'a pas parlé de, alors on a parlé d'outillage, on est en train de creuser tout ça, et on n'a pas encore parlé d'intelligence artificielle. Ça permet,
is this something that can reduce costs today, or is it going to make it possible in the future to reduce costs? Are you going to be recruiting artificial intelligence, using artificial intelligence on simple tasks? So is this something promising that you think is interesting, that should make it possible to reduce costs or not? Are we talking about LLMs or artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence, I would say. We do have some use of LLMs, internal LLMs, because we don't trust other solutions. And this works quite well for quite limited scopes, but it does work. We do use them for that. Then, apart from that, I think we're watching, we're keeping an eye on what's happening, because if it's artificial intelligence from one of the GAFAM, we don't want it. I was going to say the same thing. Wait and see. I think we're waiting for others to try things out and to put up with the problems that go with that. We're not ruling it out, but I think we have to see what it can do. But I'm not sure it's really going to make financial savings. I'm not sure it's going to save us cash, but we will see in the future. I don't think I agree. I think even as a startup, we have a big difficulty, which is finding the right resources, the right talent. And my objective is not to use office software, so I do use artificial intelligence, and we do tell our customers to protect their data in sovereign cloud, if possible. And we have noticed two clients last week. There were two clients last week who asked me for something quite utopian, but that they want to move away from reliance on the US. It's a big challenge. And we do realize that artificial intelligence, everybody wants to go there, and I think we will have to go there. But as a CISO, you need to analyze the risks of what you accept in terms of data protection and confidentiality. Perfect. Another focus which came up in our preparations is I was speaking to a CISO last year who said that, okay, I have no budget, so I have other people do the work. He was joking, but ultimately these are projects that do have risks, and so they use the budgets from the business lines, as there isn't a centralized CISO budget. So I don't know if this is a good practice or a practice that exists elsewhere, or if there's a real saving for the company, but for the CISO, that's probably a very short-term approach. But this can be much broader. Can you rely on federations or bodies that don't just produce white papers, but also go much further, but that can federate and help with a view to reducing costs? Is this something that is happening? Is it something that's possible? Is it something we want to do? I do this enormously on almost everything. For lots of reasons. To give one example, we defined a program to assess the knowledge of secured programming among engineers or developers, and depending on the results, some people had to go and take a course. So we found a course and chose that. But as it's the heads of departments who have this ownership of the risks, ultimately, the reason for which we did this initially was that there was a risk had been identified by the heads of departments for our products, and who thought that we could do better in this respect. So when they then came to me to say, yeah, but your course is no good, I said, it's not my course. You decided that you didn't want to accept the risk linked with the technical skills in developer security. You asked me to make that assessment. Now, with the results, we have to place the cursor somewhere. But if you want to do another course because you think the one we defined is not good, there's no problem. But in that case, you need to choose it, to find it, and to have your teams take the course. And I really did see among some of them that they did suddenly realize that it's their risk and not mine, the risk linked to their developers, although it is partly my issue. But said, yes, it's true, I didn't want to. I wasn't at ease with this level of risk for my developers. And that changes the mentality when they see that they are the owners of this. And then with the idea of having to choose another course, it wasn't that the attitude was this or that person didn't get a very good score in the assessment. What do I think would be a better use of their time? And so they came up with lots of different courses, and now in fact we have a catalogue with lots of different courses, depending on whether it's back-end, front end, whatever the language or the platform, etc. And so, in fact, I found this was quite an evocative example of how we can have quite a big impact on something that's quite important. And most of the effort wasn't made by us. We established the framework. We reminded people that there was a reason why they wanted this. We helped them to do certain things, but after that, it was up to them to handle the policing of their teams, to see whether their teams had or had not done the courses, or perhaps to postpone the courses because they had a deadline coming up. So they managed all of this and not us. And I did find that extremely efficient.
C'est tout à fait vrai ce que tu dis d'ailleurs.
Quite true.
Faire bosser les autres, déjà, moi j'adore ça.
I love having other people do the work. Clearly,
donc si on peut en...
we already have a lot of work, so if we can have somebody else do some of it, it's always nice.
Effectivement, là tu parles en interne.
But here, when you're talking internally,
that's
the whole question, as you said, of the risk owner, the business line. It's reversing the burden of proof.
Alors ça, ceci étant dit, si on dit ça et donc on dit on va faire bosser les métiers en interne, d'un point de vue global, il faut quand même être bien conscient que le coût reste dans l'entreprise. Donc il n'est pas dans le budget du CISO, mais bon, il est quand même dans le...
The cost is still there for the company. It may not be the CISO's budget, but it's still in the budget of the company. So even if overall financially it doesn't change anything, I think it is important because it enables us to make the business lines more accountable, to accept the risks, even if they're not always aware of them. So I think it's really a question of accountability.
Et finalement, là tu parlais de la formation, mais en fait c'est vrai pour plein de choses, et c'est ce que j'essaie de faire de plus en plus chez CNP, par exemple, faire prendre déjà conscience aux différents métiers, donc ça s'appelle des BU chez nous, aux différentes BU de leur propre risque de sécurité. Donc on a fait ce qu'on appelle des maturités sécurité BU. Et donc c'est un PowerPoint assez resserré qu'on va présenter.
Maturity assessment is a PowerPoint that we present to the management, PowerPoints that we present to the management of the different business units to present their risks to them, to explain them, first of all, the applications they're using, because often they don't even know what applications they have. And among those applications are their vulnerabilities.
Est-ce que tous leurs collaborateurs sur leur périmètre ont bien suivi la formation annuelle?
Have all their staff in their scope done the annual cybersecurity training? Are they aware of phishing? Are they more or less aware of phishing in relation to the other BUs? Are there any problems of obsolescence on the servers which host their apps? Then their third parties. Are their third parties sufficiently secure? And often they don't. We provide them with a list of their third parties, and some of them they're not even aware of. So this can go quite a long way. It's the idea of making them aware of their own risks and of the risks which they de facto accept. And then we can try to reduce them.
C'est vraiment déjà leur faire prendre conscience. Et après, leur faire prendre conscience qu'en fait, quand ils font un projet, dans le projet, il faut prendre en compte le coût des mesures de sécurité. On va lancer l'application, par exemple, mais aussi dans le temps, le maintien en condition de sécurité. Ça, c'est quelque chose chez CNP qui
maintaining the security, the proper security over time thereafter, because a project is not just a project and then we forget it. You then have to maintain the security conditions once it's up and running. And often there is no ring-fenced budget for the coming years for that maintenance, because next year and the year after they're going to have to do this or that in terms of maintenance of security, and that's something which is often forgotten. At least in my company, I hope it's different for you. So that's the first focus internally. And then you were talking about the associations and federations. I'm an administrator of the CESIN, which is one of the associations which works on this, with a whole range of events and deliverables and publications. And I think within the CISO community, it's very important to share this experience, to do mentoring,
de faire des retours d'expérience sur les outils, parce que ça aussi c'est important. On parlait de la mise d'outils, donc voilà, avoir un retour vraiment terrain et pas
having feedback from the field about the tools rather than just the salesperson selling their miracle solution to us. I think that's very important.
C'est quelque chose aussi, enfin, personnellement j'y crois beaucoup.
Personally, I believe very strongly in this, which is collective
parce que on aura eu, quelqu'un aura présenté quelque chose, on aura retenu une idée, et donc du coup ça va donner plein de
it gives us an idea, which then leads to other ideas, and I think that's very important.
C'est pas faire vraiment bosser les
So it's not really having other people do the work for us, but it's working together. Perhaps that's how I would say it, the idea of working together.
Donc voilà, moi c'est un sujet qui me parle.
It's a subject which I really find interesting.
En tout cas, je peux que souscrire à cet appel à travailler ensemble,
with this call
parce que
to
quand on
work
dit faire
together.
plus avec
Because
moi,
when we say do more with less at the agency, we are directly concerned by this. I wouldn't say with less, but in the future we have to do more with NIS2. We'll have to do this with 10 to 15 times more entities which will be regulated under NIS2, so with 10 times greater need for support, and so we have to multiply the action of the agency to be able to support all those entities, and that requires a strategy of relays through the professional federations and the CESIN in particular, and also the sector federations with which we are going to be doing consultations on the implementation of the NIS2 system and the regulatory aspects of that system. So consulting with the ecosystem to work together on all these aspects. It's important to have those relays. The other strategy which we are implementing and which I would like to draw your attention to is a strategy of industrialization of our services through digitalization services. So we've launched a cyber platform online where you can find resources and services on the usual themes of the agency, informing, preparing, responding, and you'll find information about NIS2 and an eligibility test. And for small companies, small entities, there's also a maturity test which is proposed with access to the different security services provided by the agency. So these cyber services are also a way of providing support to you and to the whole ecosystem.
Yes, I agree with everything that was said. We have the same thing. We have in Luxembourg, we have sector federations. I've been CISO for a few years. We created a network experience sharing platform between CISOs and different companies. Just like the CESIN kind of club that allows us to share experience and best practices. We used to implement robotic automation that allows us to reduce costs and to avoid human error on classic automation, let's say. The information sharing is very important because and we organize a lot of webinars and seminars for our clients, and we got needs to as regulations, and we have the same in Luxembourg. Typically, all those federations, the CESIN, for example, or the professional occupational federation for building, for example, do they need to publish white papers, feedback on experience, or can they not influence service providers to give them the direction of what is needed to have less of fewer silos? Is it an utopia? It's not a utopia. We need to give to receive. That's why the sharing of information is, and I see it within my startup. We need to share your knowledge to the newly arrived talents, and you have to do that without expecting something in return. Because the sharing of best practices can sometimes save a client from cyber threats. Because smaller entities don't have big budgets or big assurance policies, and if they undergo a cyber threat, they will have troubles defending against the cyber criminals. So we need to accept giving free information. I would say let's try, and we'll see. I think that we do it partly, not just through the associations. In our group CNP, we have a funding entity for startups, and I sit at the board, and it's another way to influence publishers. And we have to exploit these privileged positions to have an influence on solution providers. We influence investors also, but sometimes funds don't have anything to do with cybers, but we have to exploit them.
So we haven't talked too much about this. We talked a bit about open source software, or is this a way of reducing the costs?
Est-ce que ça représente un vrai axe où on se dit finalement on va pas payer de licence parce qu'on va pas
So, does this make a difference for us? It is a solution. I don't know if it's really realistic for everybody, but we use this a lot. We also contribute. All the Proton products are open source. We also maintain the OpenPB library. So we take and we give. So for us, it clearly is a solution. There are a lot of things that exist, and I think that it's a question of mentality. And I think if we're not used to this mentality, it's difficult to accept this or to work in that direction. But now that I've been at Proton for almost 4 years, I see that it does seem to be a genuine solution, I think. Yeah, I think that this can reduce costs, but we shouldn't forget that there are also hidden costs, that we need to have the right people to debug certain applications. It'll be easier to find engineers for Microsoft or others, or then for open source. I wasn't keen at the beginning on an open source approach, but when you do have a company, we do look closely at the costs of our structure, and we do use open source software. But when you do have an issue on the tool, it is very complicated. But I think we need to look into it, at least that's clear. I think it's the same. I have no
voilà, je pense qu'il ne faut pas se fermer.
Dogma in this. I don't think we should close any doors, especially for small entities that don't necessarily have the resources. This open source approach can be a solution. I also like what we call hybrid solutions, where you have a free and a paying versions. You can use the free version to test things out with the different proofs of concept. It's quite simple to do. And then if you do want to go further, then you can switch over to the paying version or stay with the free version. So for us, we don't rule anything out. I think it can also be an avenue to be explored on the question of the resources. There's also the option, there's lots of open source software you can pay to have the service, the advice, the maintenance, or to ask for help when you have an issue. We do also use this, and in that way we also contribute to the organizations which provide the software, and then sometimes we use their services in return or not. But I think it is a good solution, I think, too. There was a point which was mentioned also on outsourcing, which can or may not bring savings in some cases on very precise security issues like for SOCs. So for people who aren't large enough to have their own SOCs and their experts, for smaller entities, outsourcing of the SOC can be a solution to reduce costs and to have access to high-level expertise. Do you see things that way? Yes, for us, the point really is there are things that we don't accept to outsource, and we just, in that case, we don't care what the cost is. In building it ourselves, at the beginning, from the beginning, we had an in-house SOC. And when I arrived, I thought, this is madness. But, in fact, it's out of the question to provide this information to an external company, even if it's Swiss or European. It's non-negotiable. We will not provide that data. And a few years later, we have an SIEM which works well. And at the time, in relation to our size, it perhaps wasn't reasonable to do this in-house, but now it seems quite consistent that we should have done it that way. We just needed to wait a bit. Obviously, as a startup, I am asking my clients to outsource their CISO, because that's my job. We've also developed SOC as a service. And although there are a lot of risks for the customers, we do understand that, as you said yourself very clearly, it is providing knowledge. There's then the SLAs, the service level agreements. Will they be complied with? Will they be? And obviously, we can't put all our eggs in the own basket, or clients can't put all their eggs in the same basket. So sometimes people do hesitate to outsource because there's a loss of control. And there you have to redo a risk analysis of the third parties and to see whether you outsource the SOC to a startup. It's a good question. In large groups, you don't really need to ask the question. They don't. But I think it's a genuine subject, and I would tend to say that we should go for it, but in some companies should go for it. But data is non-negotiable, and in Luxembourg, the regulator is extremely strict. The data cannot leave Luxembourg. There's sovereign cloud. And then there's the whole aspect of the exit strategy, what you do if there's a breakdown, can you recover the data? And there will be costs linked to the reintegration and to finding a new provider. So outsourcing, yes, but think about it, talk about with the security officer or the CISO to do a financial analysis to see whether the provider is sound. But it is an interesting but complex subject. I think we have to strike the right balance, and that balance may change over time. Just to give you an example, at CNP before, we wanted our providers to have the capacity to provide things because our team was not sufficient. Now our team is bigger. What I'm looking for really is the technical skills
un expert architecture réseau.
I have an architecture network expert. Soon I'll be looking for other experts. So over time we have changed our approach, always with some outsourcing. And so the challenge is the security of the outsourcing chain, because it might not just be the first tier, there's also tier 2 and other tiers. But coming back to what Aurélie said, I think DORA for financial institutions like us, or NIS2, that is the idea behind this. Absolutely. That is the ambition of NIS2 for the scope it covers, with a much larger scope than NIS1, which was only for entities of essential services, which were designated. Now we have a logic of 18 sectors of activity with rules where it's not the national authority which designates the entities which are regulated, but that it's the entities which enter within the framework, and this is based on Annex 2. But in this, there are two annexes. Annex 1 for the highly critical entities, and then in Annex 2, the critical sectors, which are in the outsourcing line, notably on production. And the idea is that directly within the scope to address this aspect, then for the security objectives, there is an objective of being able to share this with the outsourcing or subcontracting chain, and DORA, which is regulated by the CPR in France, goes further, because there in DORA there are requirements and a system of control of outsourcing at different levels down to tier 2, and with also an obligation to do mapping of the outsourcing and subcontractors, with always the question of being how to help the smaller subcontracting or providers, and to optimize the work of the CISOs, and especially with filling out all the questionnaires you have to fill out, so to see how you can enhance your security level through this, and these are the subjects the agency is working on.
Merci.
Thank you. Any other reactions or things that have been mentioned that spring to mind?
Je pense que les leviers, ce n'est pas forcément technique. C'est vrai que nous, on navigue beaucoup dans la technique, donc on pense souvent outils quand on cherche un levier. Si on prend un peu de recul, je vais vous donner un exemple. Chez CNP, quand on regarde le risque de fuite de données, comme on a 14 millions de clients, le principal chez nous, c'est le coût des lettres recommandées en cas de fuite de données. Un recommandé, ça coûte entre 5 et 6 euros. Alors, j'ai pris les tarifs
€6 per registered letter.
Voilà, donc 5 ou 6 euros multipliés par 14 millions.
5 or 6 euros multiplied by 14 million. You can do the calculation for yourself.
Finalement, enfin, on a fait ce constat.
We have noted this, and we thought to ourselves, how could we do this
et en fait, en y réfléchissant avec le métier,
by thinking it through with the business unit,
mais en fait, si on avait les adresses mail de tous les clients,
we had the email addresses of all our customers, which isn't the case, let's face it. We have a population also of people that don't necessarily have email addresses, but at least for all the customers who have an email address, we could notify them electronically, and that would make a huge saving.
C'est pas du tout une solution technique, hein, récupérer.
And in the end, it's not even a technical solution, getting their email addresses or their phone numbers.
De MFA facilement, mais
it also makes MFA easier, but it's the business unit, in fact, which has to go out and get the information, but that can also be useful for us. And it's just one, I think, striking example. And I think there's probably lots of others that we could identify. So if we take a step back and stop thinking purely in terms of our natural technical environment, I think there are other levers we can use.
Voilà, nous, c'est sûr que ça nous ferait gagner en
it's sure that would make, in the case of a data leak, which we haven't had for the moment, at least a major one, that would make a big saving for us. It would reduce the cost drastically.
C'est une idée que je vous
It's an idea I'm just putting out there like that.
Moi, j'en aurais peut-être une
I perhaps have one other,
peut-être n'est pas directement
which
liée à
isn't
la
perhaps directly
sécurité, mais
linked to
de manière générale,
security, but more generally, one of the things that Proton has done
c'est que tous les
that
employés
all
sont
the employees
actionnaires de
are
l'entreprise.
shareholders, have some shares in the company.
Mais de manière générale, tout le monde
generally, everybody has at least some shares in different quantities. And when there are new arrivals each month, when I do the security onboarding, meeting, I show them 2 articles from newspapers, Okta and Yahoo, about Okta and Yahoo, where during negotiations for a takeover of Verizon, lost billions in market cap, with the message being that you're joining Proton, you're a shareholder. If you want to be rich, we have to avoid having security incidents. It's very simple. That's not really the aim, ultimately. But I think the fact that the employees have an interest in the company working well and not having big problems for a company like ours, a security problem would be important. But it also makes people more accountable, responsible, and they try not to create an incident themselves, or they try to minimize that risk. And so rather than ignoring something or just not paying attention, they might actually report it. And I think that is quite effective, and it's not something, at least in Switzerland, it's rare, it's very rare, to have this notion of ownership among the employees of a company. It's something that's more widespread in the tech sector in the US. In France, I don't know. But I do find this quite intelligent as an approach. I think we have a maximum of 7 or 8 minutes. Are there any questions from the floor? There's a microphone we can hand around if you have any questions. Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Just a question. We've talked a lot about risk assessment, and also we need to talk about risk management, so it's good to identify things to do. But the problem I have after that is what can we do? I have often different priorities that come up, and the priorities change. I would like to have a dashboard that tells me today the priority is this, this or this, and I have difficulty finding a tool or a way of organizing to do this. We use Excel. But the advantage sometimes of not having a cool tool that does everything is that it has to stay simple. I have a risk register where I aim for 10, but I never manage that. But 15 is quite good. 20, I can't go above 20. And Excel works very well.
Si on parle de rajouter,
si on
parle de rajouter un outil, on ne fait pas tellement avec moins, mais pourquoi pas. Nous, on a essayé plusieurs outils et pour l'instant, on n'a pas trouvé le bon.
Voilà, for the moment, we haven't found the right one. So for the moment, it's Excel that remains my best friend in this respect.
Ça fait quand même le job.
But it does the job.
Moi, Excel est mon ennemi.
Excel is my enemy. Because as a startup, obviously, I find the files from my work among other clients, so I look for an open source solution, which I found here at the forum last year. It's a tool, a GRC tool, which a CRM tool, multi-tenant, multi-user. And my issue is, even as a startup, I have a team of 10 people working on customers, and I want to know who has changed a risk on a given day, to have the history of this. And I have difficulty with Excel finding that information. So if I think you're the owner of the Excel file, you might have control over that, as I saw when I worked in a large group. But when you have several different people working on an Excel file, it is complicated. So I suggest I won't give the name of the solution I found, but they are here. And it is open source.
Tu peux citer?
Yeah, I can.
C'est CISO Assistant.
CISO Assistant. That's the name. As it's open source, we can save the name.
Merci beaucoup pour cette
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a small question or comment. I was wondering whether the ecosystem is not a bit responsible for the situation we're in. I have issues at the moment of renewal of licenses for tools, where sometimes the annual price is doubled. I have prices rising, but my budget isn't increasing at the same speed when I'm having to pay twice as much. So I know there are different acronyms, which are miracle solutions, which come out every month, but without most companies really putting the bases in place. Are we not really sort of going too fast, rather than seeking to have a more sparing, cost-effective, efficient approach? Open source is perfect for this. The manager I spoke with recently said to me, each time there's a renewal, there's issues, we talk about it for ages. We have the impression of wasting loads of time discussing whether to buy the license. But if we can't build things ourselves, it takes time, it's complicated, but next year you don't have that discussion about paying for a license if you build it yourself, nor the year after that, nor the year after that, nor the year after that, if you build it yourself.
Peut-être un petit complément sur les aspects de TGM. De très nombreuses années.
Having followed this for many years, I've noticed that.
Je vous parlais même. Des cheveux blancs, donc j'ai démarré en francs.
I began in France at 7,000.
Aujourd'hui, effectivement, vous avez des TGM qui tournent autour des 1 000 euros.
So the average daily rates with senior.
Moi, j'ai pas ressenti une explosion.
So I haven't seen an explosion in the price in the average daily rate. And if we, as consulting and service firms, we want to provide added value and to be augmented consultants, we can, but we haven't, unfortunately, I would almost say, we haven't seen an explosion in the average daily rates. I don't have a miracle solution, but what I would add is that I haven't, to recruit. When we recruit people, we have the same issue. We have people with very little experience and who ask for huge amounts of money. So I share what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I don't have a solution, but I think collectively we do have to do something, whether it's an external consultant or recruiting someone internally. Is there one last question?
Hello. I just had a small question concerning the software publishers. Will there be new regulations in the coming years, maybe in banking? For example, in banking, healthcare, they have solutions that are very state-of-the-art, but if we want to go to a superior OS, where I work in the clinic where I work, we upgraded Windows to Windows 10, and we had a new solution for that. So, will there be regulations to stop creating solutions for upgrading? This is the ambition of the CRA, to have one regulations on services, including software. The CRA is addressing the lower levels of security requirements, and when we change a version, addressing also change of versions. The other aspect is that we work with business sectors.
Avec les secteurs d'activité et les fédérations professionnelles, le fait que les entreprises se regroupent, partagent ces problématiques.
In those sectors, companies unify themselves, federate themselves, and that's the ambition of the CRA, to regulate those solutions.
J'ai eu la chance de travailler, de
rencontrer un CISO who worked for the control tower in Luxembourg,
des vieux PC,
working on old computers. with
c'est un système de sécurité pour
security
le contrôle aérien.
system, and there it's for air traffic control, and the issue they had wasn't necessarily the software, but they could no longer find the processes to operate the former system. It's not just the software, there's a whole risk analysis that has to be done of how long the application can be used, and also the hardware you need to operate the software. And they took 5 years to find a solution, and they had to buy 10 equivalent computers because they could no longer find the boards that they needed to operate the software they had developed. So you really, regardless of the regulations, you have to do a risk analysis of how long that system can be sustainable, and also to have a migration or transfer plan. In that case, thank you very much. I think we have identified a few avenues or levers for containing costs for coming years. A big thank you to all our speakers. It was very interesting to think this over with you, and thank you very much to all of you for your attention.